To say. I'm really going to be emphasizing the second half of the subtitle, Benedictine Spirituality, and probably I'd like to say something like Benedictine Spirituality for everybody, because that's really what my sort of general interest and theme is on this, and you'll see how that develops. First of all, Lent, as we all know, is a time for Christians to take time to sort of examine our lives, not in a heavily introspective way, but to look at how we're progressing, where are we going in our response to our Christian vocation. We all have a Christian vocation, and we all are either moving well or not so well along a path to the fulfillment of that call. And we're all, at least most of us, not all of us, I guess not in this room, but most of us are of an age when we remember that Lent consisted of developing a program where you sort of added or subtracted to your life. You sort of did more things which were good, or you gave up sort of things which were, if not exactly bad, at least bad for you. Candy and all sorts of stuff like that when we were very little. And without much attention to the overall question of our Christian lifestyle. And fortunately, we have reached a point now, I think, where we take a much more, shall we say, holistic and positive attitude toward Lent. It may be that, in fact, we ought to be doing less of things which would be regarded as good, and perhaps more of things which society today would regard as not good, like rest and exercise and things of that kind. So we have at least reached a kind of a new, well, perhaps a recovered, an older understanding of what we should be doing during Lent. Benedictine Spirituality, the big term, which basically means just trying to follow Christ, to live the gospel in the spirit of Benedict and his rule. And it is not just something for people who live in monasteries or convents or behind cloister walls. I think more and more we're coming to realize that Benedict has something to say in a variety of aspects of life for a lot of different kinds of people. And so that's really kind of the general theme which I want to kind of dwell on. It's not just for the few, it's really for the many. More and more it's being discovered as a kind of a way of being Christian, which particularly meets the needs of the 21st century, highly programmed and overworked men and women living and working in what we call the world. And this is not just something for Catholics. In fact, one might say it's kind of almost been especially developed by non-Catholics who have come to find in St. Benedict's rule a kind of message for the modern man and woman, a message for the modern world. And having said that, I'm going to actually give a great big huge footnote right here to one of my favorite authors on this subject whom I think is extremely important, and that is to the English laywoman Esther de Waal. I'm sure many of you have heard of her, who has written a number of books about Benedictine spirituality. She's actually comes to the United States frequently. I think is going to be here next week for a couple of talks, and has been here once or twice. Her husband was the Dean of Canterbury Cathedral, and so for years she lived within the close of Canterbury Cathedral, surrounded by the monastic ruins, and that led her to wonder where all these ruins came from and why, and to do more research and reading about things Benedictine, and to come to this much deeper appreciation of what Benedict had to say, not only for his own time, but for us, and not only for monks, but for people living normal, everyday lives in the world. The Benedictine Way, titled one of her books actually, the Benedictine Way is one of balance. And that's really the kind of the sort of general thrust of what I want to talk about today. Balance as a part of Benedictine spirituality. The contemporary world's way is, as we all know, one of imbalance, which leads to perpetual stress and excessive busyness and exhaustion both of mind and of spirit, body, mind, and spirit. We have this wonderful word which we now use now, and we hold it up as a kind of ideal. We talk about multitasking. And as far as I can see, what that means is we are able to do a number of things simultaneously without giving our full attention to any of them. And I think that is largely what that comes down to. And I don't want to sound like a Luddite. I don't think I really am a Luddite, although my ease with a lot of contemporary technology, as Peter Collins can readily tell you, is pretty limited. But I'm just about able to manage email and things like that. Anyway, the invention of the cell phone and the smartphone, wonderful things. They enable us to multitask, but sometimes those things that are supposed to simplify our lives end up complicating them further, or at least bringing further kinds of stress. Email is another one of those things, and I heard, I think it was on the radio the other day, I can't remember when or where, there was a little story about a businessman somewhere who, for 1 week, forbade the use of any internal emails within his company. And at first, everyone was in total panic. How were they ever going to be able to function without it? By the end of the week, they had discovered actually life was a whole lot easier. And human relationships had developed, and tensions, which, it's quite easy to create tensions. I'm sure you've all had this experience because you can be really nasty in an email and not feel too terribly guilty about it. And from the moment you press send, you feel relieved, right? And strong. And then it's reciprocated and so forth. And but this gentleman found that the people who had most hated the idea actually discovered that they were now somehow in a week had become nicer people, and that people they had tension with electronically, once they had to actually talk to one another about the problem, actually found that they were able to understand one another and became, if not friends, at least cooperative and positive co-workers. Well, that's just a little example. Another example, which is hitting home to me at the moment, is I have a small class of juniors and seniors, only 7 of them, and they sit, it's in comparative politics, they sit on one side of the table and I sit on the other, and 4 of the 7 have laptops open. So what I'm looking at now is not really faces, but the rear covers of the laptops. And of course, I don't really know what's going on into the machine. But I know that basically nobody is actually listening to me anymore, that it's going from my words are somehow going into the laptop without actually possibly passing through the minds of either one of us in one way or another. But in any case, you then ask a question, they have no idea what the question's all about because they were so busy entering the data. So some of these things are helpful in some ways and in some ways not, but I want to get off that particular case. Benedict, in his rule for monasteries, calls for a life built on moderation. And Americans are not very good at moderation, but he calls for that. A sense of proportion, and what he calls discretio, which is not quite what we mean by discretion, but with him, discretio means more like really a sense of proportion, a sense of balance, being sensible about how much you do in any one aspect of your life. Benedict obviously lived and wrote long before the Renaissance, and so the concept of the Renaissance man or woman was not something quite understood, but he was, after all, a product of classical Roman culture, which wasn't very different from the idea of the Renaissance man. They had a similar ideal of balance between mind, body, and spirit. The Romans did sort of adopt a lot of their ideas, their sort of intellectual insights from the Greeks, but at the same time they were very good at building roads and bridges and viaducts and all sorts of things to make life possible. So they brought that sense of balance between the idea and the practical, which is what we usually think of about the Renaissance man. Someone like Leonardo da Vinci, who was a great artist and a sculptor, but also was passionately interested in what we would call today technology, and experimenting with solar energy and flight, and he even had a kind of some sort of draft for what we would call today a helicopter and things like that. So he was not limited to anything. He was interested in, his mind went in many different directions. Benedict also uses that classical tripartite division, mind, body, and spirit, as the three pillars of human life, all needing to be present in any truly real human life, and all needing to be balanced for spiritual health as well as for physical health. And those of you who are familiar in any way with his rule know that he was very careful in allotting in his scheduling for the monastic day, allotting certain time periods for different things. And he really wanted those time schedules kept to. There were certain hours for prayer, which was the way in which you cared for the spirit. There were certain hours set aside for what he called Lectio Divina, hard to translate that, sort of spiritual reading, study. In any case, it was care of the mind, expanding your intellectual outlook, and work. And for him, that was the care of the body. Now, he regarded work not as something just that you had to do to earn your living, but rather something that was important because we are physical as well as spiritual, and the body also needs to be exercised in different ways. And so he saw work as something which was important for human advancement, not just a necessary evil, to sort of put the meat and bread on the table. His monks had as a foundation of their lives the three vows, which I'm sure you've all heard about, and which, first of all, obedience, which for him, which does not mean just keeping the law, keeping the rules, or answering the superior, but actually listening and learning, not just from the superior, but from one another. Stability, the second, which means rootedness, and that didn't mean for him just a geographical being stuck in one place, but actually an interior rootedness, being comfortable with yourself, really. And the third one, that untranslatable conversatio morum, which I think probably the best translation for practical purposes is something like adaptability to life situations, being flexible. So the stability and the flexibility seem like they might be opposites, but they're not opposites. They do really kind of, they complement one another. Now, obedience is something which is a part of every human life, not just for people who are living in a monastery or religious orders. It's an element of every human life, as you well know from your daily experience. We never can have our own way totally. And to try for it generally leads to disaster. We can't have our own way in all things all the time. Obedience is not just a question of obeying the laws, obviously the laws of God, the laws of the church, and so forth, the laws of the state. But there's an element of obedience in any kind of serving spouses in a way have to be obedient to one another, and in a strange way, even parents to children. I mean, what I mean by that is responsibilities and carrying out responsibilities that are a form of obedience. And any of you who have, and many of you have, had the experience of raising families and know how much time is devoted to ferrying your children from one overly programmed activity to another in all parts of the suburbs, know that in a way you're also being obedient to your children. And consequently, that's a factor of life. Obedience in the workplace and in the political order. So stability, and stability means knowing who we are and accepting who we are. Not necessarily being perfectly satisfied and knowing that we can improve, that we can change, but that we understand ourselves pretty well, we understand our personalities, we understand our limitations, and we understand our talents, and we are comfortable with ourselves. We're not filled with self-hatred. We're comfortable in our skin. That's necessary interior stability for the exterior stability in our relationships with others. The interior part leads to the exterior part. Until we're comfortable with ourselves and know who we are, we can't really live effectively and positively in a relationship with another person or with our family or with our workplace or indeed in the political order. Stability means not being too quick to run away from what is difficult. And a lot of these things I'm saying, I think probably will jump out at you that these are things which clearly need to be a part of what we would call a Benedictine philosophy of education, because trying to bring young people to understand that if it's difficult, it doesn't mean it needs to be fled, right? That sometimes difficulties simply have to be faced, accepted, and grown through. Conversatio morum in daily life means not being stuck narrowly in any one way, our way of doing things, but being open to change when called on by life's events. And Benedictine spirituality is not about escaping from the human situation. Many Eastern spiritualities, which have become very popular in our day, do in one way or another sort of promote the idea of escaping from the physical, escaping, sort of transcending the human, and reaching a kind of purely spiritual state. And at times, Christian teachers have, I think somewhat mistakenly, adopted some elements of that in their own teaching at different times in Christian history. But Christian, and therefore Benedictine spirituality, is decidedly incarnational. And what we mean by that, of course, is God became human in Jesus and sanctified the human. And he sanctified every aspect of being human. And we don't reach God by leaving the body and the human behind. We don't reach God by somehow balloon-like rising up above it all. Become sort of bodiless semi-angels. And if you try to do that, in that way lies madness. And sometimes Christian ascetics at different periods of monastic history have gone that route. There are stories in the Fathers of the Desert about, and I think in modern times even this has been discovered at times like places like Mount Athos, where very severe ascetic hermits living in the sort of caves in the side of cliffs, practicing intense self-punishment, you might say, feeling that they had overcome the body and that they were now purely spiritual, have decided they were now angels and basically, put it kind of crudely, could fly, only to find that they're on the rocks below. So, I mean, to try to escape from the human is not practical or possible. Benedict's image of the way to God, in contrast to the balloon image, is very down to earth. It's a ladder. A ladder. We all experience ladders. And we all know that ladders have to have two sides. Have to be pretty strong, but they have to have two sides parallel. And if they're going to do any good at all to us, the feet have to be on the ground, firmly anchored some way, right? And that if they're not parallel, the rungs in place are not going to work, and it's all going to fall apart. And so the sides of the ladder are important. One side, as far as Benedict's teaching, using his image of the ladder, which comes from the Bible, of course. One side is the body, the other is the spirit. And they have to work in parallel if the rungs are going to be usable at all. And Benedict has a long chapter on humility. Indeed, he's regarded as the doctor humilitatis, the great teacher of humility. He says there are 12 steps, which is ironic, but he has a 12-step approach too. To climb, to reach God, he says it's by humility that we rise, and as we go up, actually it becomes easier because we can jettison more and more baggage, because we all start the process with a lot of baggage, And the more we get rid of, the easier it is to climb, and the closer we will come to a relationship with God. Benedict says the climb of the ladder, of course, involves effort, but it's possible for everybody. He was not writing his rule for spiritual athletes. He was quite clear that he was developing what he called a little rule, a moderate rule, because he said he wanted it to be possible for everybody with reasonably good intentions and strength to be able to make this climb, and that's what he was setting out to do. And he pointed out the spiritual dimension involves humility and developing a focused heart through prayer and silence and all those practices. The bodily dimension involves acts of concrete service to those around us, right? Actually doing things for people, not just musing about it and meditating on it and praying about it, but actually doing things, using the body to serve those who are in need. And that would involve, again, physical work at times. He said both sides of the ladder are strengthened by the intellectual dimension of our use of scripture, our use of spiritual reading, and so forth. But we're climbing that ladder in the balance between the physical dimension of our humanity and the spiritual dimension of our humanity. Benedict calls for moderation in all things. And again, I'm saying he's writing this rule for monasteries. And he probably didn't. It's hard to say. He never imagined that his rule was going to become a great source of spiritual growth for everybody. He was writing for one monastery, after all. But he would have been satisfied and pleased to see that it was a help to many people. He calls for moderation. Enough prayer, but not overdoing it. Enough food and drink, but not overdoing it. And enough asceticism, but by no means overdoing it. In other things, he said balance is important for everything. If you read Benedict's chapter on food, the food for monks, meals for monks, the Desert Fathers of the earlier time would have been severely scandalized by it. Admittedly, he says meat only for the sick, but that was the way most people lived in those days. I mean, the sort of, shall we say, the peasant class didn't have access to a lot of meat, and so Benedict was more or less saying his monks are going to live more or less like the people around them, but he's quite clear he needs to have plenty there. People are not going to be constantly fasting. He even says, it's a grudging concession, but he says, although probably monks shouldn't have wine, but nobody's going to accept that, so they should have wine at meals, but not overdo it, obviously. So he's reasonable on that as he is on everything else. Even in Lent, now he has a chapter on the observance of Lent. There you think you would find, here's where he's really going to get serious about a tough ascetical program for Lent. But in fact, there again, it's a very balanced, moderate program. What he says is that, first of all, he says, well, a monk's regular life should have a Lenten character. But not everyone has the strength for that. So at least during those weeks, a little more prayer, maybe a little less sleep, maybe a little less time wasting, and a little less food. But it says none of these programs should be undertaken as a kind of individual program without checking it with a superior. It says we're not the best judges of what is best for ourselves. And so it should be checked with the spiritual father who can determine whether we're not doing enough or whether we're doing too much. But in any case, there again, balance and a judgment from someone who hopefully is more experienced in ourselves in doing this. Benedict would not have known the word workaholic, right? But he would have found workaholism as just as destructive for the human personality as alcoholism or gluttony or any of those other things. Because he said too much of any one thing is actually destructive of the spirit, as it frequently is of the body. So for Benedict, every part of life and every part of the day is good and valuable. He's quite clear that work is important, but work is not everything. He's quite clear that prayer is important, but perhaps surprisingly, prayer is not everything. He says they have to go together, and they have to relate to one another. He sees no division between the secular and the sacred in his mindset. He never wants any of his monks, and I would say this applies, obviously what I mean when I say monks is anyone who's trying to live according to the spirit of Benedict. He never wants anyone to say that he has too much work to do to pray. Or he doesn't want anybody to say, I'm so immersed in my prayer that I can't really help you right now. Right? Both things, he says, are equally wrong, equally bad. No one should be so, and no one should ever say he's, as we hear, don't we, all the time, I'm too busy to eat. I can't take time. I have to grab something at my desk because I can't really take time to eat, and I don't get enough. 8 hours of sleep, ridiculous. 7 hours of sleep, ridiculous. People take pride in how little sleep they get. I mean, don't you? I find that all the time. I also find that when you ask somebody, whether it's anybody, including a monk, how are you? What is the first answer you usually get? Busy. Way too busy, right? That's the first answer. It's a kind of, whether it's true or not, it's like a badge of honor that I have too much to do, so I must be important because I have all this stuff to do. You almost stop asking people because you get tired of that particular answer. But Benedict would not have understood that answer. His idea is that we need to strive to create a life situation in which we have balance. All moderns, our contemporaries, see our work as the center of life. And everything else is at best a necessary, kind of annoying distraction like we do have to eat. We do have to get a certain amount of sleep. Or else it's a really bad kind of distraction which we ought to be able to suppress. We ought to be able to get along with 4 hours sleep, something like that. And so if we can't, we need to really work at it, because the less sleep, the more important we must be. And also we need to, Benedict did not in his monasteries envision the need for a gym or an exercise room, because in his monastery people were doing heavy manual labor. The ancients didn't really have, I think, the idea of getting exercise. They were working in farms or at some craft, the body was getting a lot of work. But we know most of the time now, most of our work is at least quasi-intellectual, with computers or at a desk, or we're not really, most of us, out, cutting down trees and plowing fields and things like that, except maybe as a recreation on weekends, but not as a part of our daily life. And Benedict would say that work, he would probably say today, if he was writing this rule, make sure you get enough physical exercise, realizing that work maybe is not that anymore for most people, even for his monks. So Benedictines, this is really kind of almost my closing point. I think Benedictines at all periods of history have had to avoid what we might call a spiritual faddism, because each generation in the Christian spirituality has come up with a new thing, which is good, but which suddenly everybody thinks needs to be a part of everything, right? And the idea of moderation and balance would be looked at times is looked upon as soft. There's nothing mediocre or easy about Benedict's approach to life. Mediocrity is not what he's looking for at all. But let's put it this way. Balance is not mediocrity. And compromise always is not always bad, in spite of what seems to happen in Congress nowadays, right? In other words, the possibility of talking and reaching a compromise, reaching a halfway solution, a middle way, is not necessarily bad. In fact, it's almost never bad. It's progress, and you can continue to progress. So he was advocating a middle way, but he was not advocating a soft way. And so, in terms of what Benedictine spirituality means for every people living everyday lives, in sort of, shall we say, more outside of a monastery, the balanced life is what he would advocate, and taking seriously the necessity of working at creating that kind of balance. When at times in Christian spirituality, I mean, Benedictines have sometimes felt a little embarrassed, with all due respect, say, to St. Francis and the ideal of poverty, that's very different from what Benedict was calling for, and yet Benedictines at times, even then and probably now, can be embarrassed by the fact that they live in communities and they have to have big buildings and so forth. They're running institutions which have to have modern equipment and so forth. Benedict is very clear about what they need. They need to have what they need to get their work done, right? And consequently, he wasn't advocating an absolute poverty, which is an ideal for some, right? Or in more modern times, the idea everybody needs to set out for the missions, right? And Benedictines didn't always do that, right? Or all educational and institutional work should be abandoned in favor of going into the inner city and undertaking activities there, which are themselves important, but not necessarily what is a part of the sort of the Benedictine spirit. So, but Benedict is quite saying avoid fads, stick to the essentials, live the balanced life, pray, work, study, serve, and do each of these things as important, neglecting none, not overemphasizing any. So living in the way of St. Benedict, his spirituality means living always in a state of what I would call creative tension. Not all tension is bad. Creative tension between stability and change, between tradition and innovation, between individual self-fulfillment and the needs of the community, whatever community you happen to be a part of. A balance between those old words, action and contemplation. A balance between the desert, as that spiritual ideal, and involvement in the marketplace. Both things have to exist. Both things have to be related. So the Benedictine way is rooted in the simple gospel message that we rise to God through humility. The words of Jesus, he who humbles himself will be exalted. That we rise to God not by escaping from the human, but by our own self-awareness, our self-honesty, our humility. We rise to God. That we are filled, ironically, by emptying ourselves, and that we receive by giving. And we look actually at Christ himself as the example, and we see that actually I'm reminded by tomorrow's gospel, actually, so I'm also thinking for a homily for another occasion, that the temptation of Jesus in the desert, when the devil said to him, turn the rock into bread and throw yourself off the temple parapet and worship me and have all these, this power. He was being attempted to short circuit the whole messianic process. Get it over with now. If you jump off the temple and the angels bear you up, everybody's going to say, he has to be the Messiah. End of story. Right? Everyone will be converted. But that wasn't the plan. That wasn't the way. In other words, he had to go through the whole process of traveling around the villages and trying to get his message across, and healing and preaching and suffering and ultimately even his own passion and death, because that was the way to the resurrection. In other words, that he was saying it's not by escape, but it's by embracing the totality of our human life and trusting in God and moving forward. That's how we reach that, let's say perfection, but that relationship with God, which really counts. So the idea of balance, discretion, is clearly something which Benedict promoted for his monks. I think in a unique way, it's a message for the 21st century, where we all have way too much to do and lead way too complicated lives, which we can't obviously immediately escape. But at least in terms of what we can do about designing our lives, we need to keep that balance, that idea of moderation and balance, not just as a kind of practical thing, but as a really important spiritual goal for ourselves. Glory be to the Father, and to the Son, and to the Holy Spirit, as it was in the beginning, is now, and ever shall be, a world without end. As a kind of official closing for our retreat day, if you can pick up one of these purple sheets again, and we'll just look at part of Psalm 31, part C, which is on the back. At the very bottom line is the antiphon of the psalm, and we'll recite the antiphon, then the psalm, and then the antiphon again. My times are in your hands, O Lord. Rescue me from my enemies. How great is your goodness, Lord, stored up for those who fear you. You display it for those who trust you in the sight of all people. You hide them in the shelter of your presence, safe from seeing enemies. You keep them in your abode, safe from plotting tongues. Blessed be the Lord, who has shown me wondrous love, and been for me a city most secure. Once I said in my anguish, I am shut out from sight. Yet you heard my plea when I cried out to you. Love the Lord, all you faithful. The Lord protects the loyal, but repays the arrogant in full. Be strong and take heart, all you who hope in the Lord. My times are in your hands, O Lord. Rescue me from my enemies. O God, the protector of all who trust in you, without whom nothing is strong and nothing is holy. Increase and multiply within us your mercy, so that you, being our ruler and our guide, we may so pass through the things of this world that we finally do not lose, but arrive at the things eternal. Grant this, O Heavenly Father, for the sake of and through Jesus Christ, your Son. Amen. That's the official conclusion of our day. Thank you all for coming. And the rest of the day will be good.